opens lines for knights, and prepares for kingside expansion. Opening the center establishes immediate central influence and prepares for rapid development. Challenging black's central pawn structure immediately to create an unbalanced game. Pushing the pawn forward immediately claims significant central space, but leaves it vulnerable and potentially overextended for later support. Expanding the center and preparing for kingside development, this offers solid piece play. Developing the knight fortifies the d4 pawn and prepares for further queenside expansion. Capturing the pawn opens the e-file and grants white's central influence, though it concedes space to black's advanced pawn. Reclaiming the pawn here opens lines for your pieces, creating immediate dynamic possibilities and contesting central space. Reclaiming the center, white prepares to develop their pieces actively and potentially exploit black's slightly cramped knight. Reclaiming the pawn immediately opens lines, but exposing your queen so early might invite trouble. Developing this knight to c3 not only contests black's queen, but also prepares to challenge control of the d4 square, potentially freeing up the c-pawn and opening lines for a more aggressive setup. Solidifying the central pawn majority, this move tactically reinforces the d4 advance while preparing to develop the queen's bishop to a more active square, potentially aiming for control of the long diagonal. Centering the pawn establishes a solid foothold in the middle, aiming to control key squares and potentially prepare for a queenside expansion or central pawn push. Pushing the e-pawn now firmly occupies central space, challenging white's knight and opening a diagonal for black's queen, hinting at an aggressive kingside buildup as the pawn chain advances. Developing the bishop here, while seemingly natural, offers black a chance to solidify their central grip and potentially target the d3 pawn. Consider how this bishop's placement influences the long diagonal and whether it creates any immediate weaknesses for white's kingside. Retreating the queen now sacrifices valuable central influence and cedes initiative, allowing white to build a commanding space advantage and potentially orchestrate a kingside attack. Securing the bishop to its logical outpost on e2 prepares for castling and supports the central pawn structure, creating a solid defensive foundation. Developing the knight to its natural outpost on f6 bolsters the center and prepares for kingside castling, while the queen's retreat to d8 was a curious detour that now needs a plan to reintegrate. Securing the king initiates a crucial phase of development, preparing to launch counterplay and potentially exploit the slightly awkward placement of black's queen on d8. The bishop's homecoming to e7 solidifies black's developing structure, preparing to cast the king to safety while maintaining a flexible pawn chain and eyeing potential central breakthroughs. Relocating the king to the h1 square offers improved safety, tucking it away from potential central pawn storms and clearing the g1 square for a knight that might eventually find its way to the kingside. Initiating castling finally secures the king, a crucial step after the earlier skirmishes in the center that left the monarch exposed. This establishes a solid defensive structure, preparing for further development and potential counterplay on the queenside or through central pawn pushes once the pieces are better coordinated. Aggressively cracking open the kingside, 12. f4 aims to exploit the slightly misplaced white queen and the awkwardness of black's central pawns to create attacking opportunities before black can fully consolidate their position. Embracing the open central files, black's pawn capture decisively sacrifices a structural pawn to ignite activity, potentially unraveling white's kingside pawn shield and creating immediate dynamic imbalances. The rook's sortie to the 4th rank unlocks the f-file for potential assault, simultaneously freeing the knight for more active participation, possibly aiming for e4, while the now somewhat exposed black monarch might soon feel the pressure. Developing the bishop to e6 solidifies black's queenside structure and prepares to challenge white's central control. However, it does leave the f-pawn temporarily unsupported, opening up potential tactical avenues for white to exploit the d4 square. Opening the d-file now, white aims to activate the rook and potentially challenge black's central pawn structure, creating dynamic play and demanding precise responses. The queen retreats to d7, a passive square that concedes central influence and leaves the pawn on d4 unchallenged for now, while simultaneously abandoning the active participation in the queenside play which was potentially brewing. Shifting the bishop to d3 solidifies control over the central light squares and prepares for potential pawn advances on the kingside, creating a more robust defensive structure while eyeing potential weaknesses in black's queenside. Challenging the center and aiming to disrupt white's development, this move boldly repositions the bishop to a more active square, eyeing the potential weakness on h2 if white's king security becomes compromised later. Gaining the d-file is paramount after black's queen retreated, so positioning the lady on d2 solidifies control and prepares for potential central breakthroughs. This maneuver by black attempts to reposition the bishop to a more active diagonal and potentially contest the h5-e8 diagonal. However, it comes at the cost of allowing white's queen a more central influence and potentially opens up avenues for white's pieces to infiltrate black's position. Consider the long-term implications of relinquishing control over the dark squares around black's king. Unlocking the kingside pawn chain now that black's bishop is precariously placed on h5. This bishop repositioning aims to both harass the queen and subtly prepare for eventual pawn pushes or file occupations. Securing the queen on a more active diagonal, the black monarch can breathe slightly easier, indirectly challenging white's seemingly dominant bishop pair and aiming to disrupt the f-pawn's future advance by potentially attacking it with a rook. Initiating pressure along the f-file now aims to dislodge black's pinned knight and potentially open lines towards their monarch, but be mindful of the potential for a premature pawn push before all pieces are adequately supported. Reconsidering the bishop's position here subtly shifts the piece's influence, placing it on a square where it might discourage white's f-pawn advance, while simultaneously preparing for potential diagonal skirmishes if the center opens further. Unleashing the rook on the h-file, a bold attempt to exploit potential weaknesses around black's castled king, though it also risks leaving the king on g1 somewhat exposed if black can create counterplay. Shifting the rook to the open file, black actively contests the central initiative and prepares for potential pawn advances, seeking to activate its dormant pieces while white's queen remains somewhat exposed. The bishop's diagonal suddenly activates, aiming to disrupt black's queenside harmony and pry open lines around the king. The queen retreats, a tactical retreat allowing pieces to regroup and contemplate a new approach after the bold raid on the kingside. Shattering black's pawn structure is the immediate goal here, opening lines and creating weaknesses around their king. The bishop's placement after the capture promises to be an active force, eyeing vulnerable squares and potentially driving black's pieces backward. It's a bold positional statement, aiming to disrupt black's comfortable setup and gain the initiative through structural concessions. Suddenly, the doubled pawns on the f-file create a structural weakness that might become a long-term liability, potentially opening lines for white's rooks to penetrate the kingside. The rook's repositioning to the third rank aims to bolster the kingside defense and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the kingside, creating a more robust setup against black's slightly more active piece placement. Shifting the queen back to d7, black solidifies its central presence and anticipates a potential kingside pawn push from white, aiming to keep the queen somewhat defended while maintaining flexibility. The subtle maneuver with the pawn to a3 aims to gain breathing room for the queenside pieces, potentially preparing b4 to challenge black's queenside space dominance and unblock the c1 bishop's diagonal. Asserting influence over the central files becomes paramount as black seeks to untangle their pieces and activate the rooks, aiming to disrupt white's seemingly consolidated position. Repositioning the rook to the d-file intensifies the pressure along that central artery, aiming to support a potential d5 pawn push or to create a battery with the queen on the open file. This maneuver also offers the rook greater flexibility, potentially shifting to the third rank for defensive duties or joining an assault on the kingside should circumstances allow. Asserting control over the central d4 square is the primary objective now, and this maneuver directly challenges white's pawn structure, potentially opening lines for black's pieces and disrupting white's planned expansion. Smashing open the center with that pawn thrust creates a dynamic imbalance. Black's queenside majority might become a liability as white's pieces gain more scope and access to vulnerable squares. Embracing the central pawn thrust, black decisively recaptures, opening lines that will soon demand attention and potentially unlock queenside play, though it concurrently invites white's pawns to advance further into the territory black aims to control. Carving open the central files, white decisively commits to the pawn storm, aiming to leverage the now dominant d-file for rook activity and to exploit the slightly weakened dark squares around black's monarch. Challenging the center's established structure, Ka6 seeks to disrupt white's control over the crucial d5 pawn and exploit the potential weaknesses created by the recent pawn exchange. Asserting dominion over the d-file seems paramount, aiming to either dislodge black's queen from its active post or prepare a deeper penetration. Retrieving the bishop to d6 seems like a sensible repositioning, aiming to reinforce the e5 pawn and potentially find a more active diagonal later. It gracefully steps away from the immediate pressure on the queen side and reestablishes a more solid defensive posture. Solidifying the king's safety is paramount, and this modest pawn advance offers a crucial escape square should enemy pieces infiltrate the queen side or center, simultaneously preparing for potential pawn breaks on the king side. Seeking to subtly liberate the cramped light-squared bishop and potentially prepare an advance on the king side. Liberating the bishop from its passive guard post opens a direct assault on black's undermined pawn structure, creating immediate tactical possibilities. Reclaiming the central square, this recapture immediately injects dynamism into the position, forcing white to reconsider their aggressive intentions on the king side. Analysis of 29, QXD6. This move is a sound and logical response for black. Let's break down why. Recapturing the pawn, *black* must recapture the pawn on d6. Leaving it would allow white to establish a dominant pawn presence in the center. Centralizing the queen, the queen, which has been somewhat passively placed on d7, now moves to a more active central square. From d6, it can potentially support pawn pushes, defend key squares, and eye the white king. Opening lines. By moving the queen, black opens up the possibility for their rook on e8 to become more active, potentially targeting the d-file or even doubling on the e-file if the situation allows. Defending key squares. The queen on d6 now adequately defends the weak pawn on e5, which was under some pressure. Strategic implications. This recapture signals a shift in black's approach. They are no longer just reacting, but actively seeking to engage and contest the center. It prepares for potential pawn breaks later in the game and helps to untangle black's pieces. Overall, 29. QXD6 is a positive step for black, consolidating their position and preparing for future action. Reactivating the rook on the e-file now aims to create pressure along that open column, potentially forcing a concession or improving white's attacking potential against black's potentially exposed king. The rook's relocation to the third rank, a seemingly straightforward action, cleverly shifts the focus of the engagement, preparing to contest the open king's file and potentially exploit the exposed royal family. Reclaiming the queen from its outpost on e3, white asserts central dominance, aiming to activate the piece in what is shaping into a more open middle game. Asserting queenside presence begins with this pawn push, aiming to expand black's influence and prepare for potential b5 advances. Pivoting the queen to *d3 aims to consolidate central control and prepare a potential kingside advance, leveraging the open files for future piece activity. Introducing the knight to the edge of the board, a daring maneuver, aims to disrupt white's central grip and potentially establish a strong outpost on f4 or g3, though it immediately exposes the knight to danger and overlooks the immediate threat to black's queenside pawns. The rook's redeployment to the central file now establishes a potent presence, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses around black's isolated king. A delightful check. This knight's unexpected sortie directly targets the monarch, forcing a defensive shuffle and creating immediate discomfort for white's king. The immediate consequence is the repositioning of the king, potentially opening lines or creating weaknesses that can be exploited later. It injects a dose of tactical urgency into what had become a somewhat static pawn structure. The king relocates to a safer square, escaping the immediate knight fork threat and preparing to potentially participate in defending the pawn structure or supporting a queenside advance, while also keeping an eye on the open kingside files. Seizing the open file presents a potent challenge, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety and perhaps force concessions. A subtle repositioning of the queen, bringing it back to a more defensive posture, is initiated here, aiming to consolidate the king's safety and prepare for potential pawn advances. A bold venture to activate the monarch, shifting him from the cramped confines of the third rank, though it opens lines of inquiry regarding his long-term safety should the central struggle intensify. A potent knight sortie, injecting dynamism into the center and probing the dark squares around black's monarch. Seizing the initiative, this recapture opens a crucial diagonal for black's queen, immediately threatening white's rook and disrupting its potential defensive structure. The exchange of queens simplifies the position, a shrewd decision to leverage white's central pawn majority and potential open files in the ensuing endgame. The rook gracefully repositions, eyeing potential incursions along the newly opened 7th rank, a subtle preparation for a decisive queenside offensive. Securing the central open file becomes the immediate priority, preventing black's rook from becoming an even more oppressive force along the 3rd rank. The rook's repositioning to the 6th rank is a bold attempt to challenge control over the open f-file, potentially disrupting white's central pressure and forcing a defensive reassessment. Challenging the queenside pawn structure, this move forces black to solidify their defenses and prevents immediate counterplay on that flank. Accepting the queen trade now simplifies the position, transitioning towards a rook endgame where black's active pieces, particularly the rook on f6, hold significant potential for creating threats and potentially exploiting weaknesses on the king side. Opening the file provides immediate attacking potential and forces black's pawns onto the defensive. The rook reoccupies the recently vacated d-file, aiming to create immediate pressure on white's advanced pawns and exploit potential weaknesses on the queen side as the game enters its endgame phase. Recentering the king becomes paramount as the board simplifies. This repositions him for active participation in the unfolding endgame, potentially targeting weakened pawns or providing crucial defensive support. Stepping the king towards the center might seem a bit premature given the rook on the 6th rank, but it's a logical transition into an endgame where king activity becomes paramount. Sizing up the remaining pawns, white initiates a king march to secure a more active position and potentially support advances on the queen side. Relocating the king towards the center initiates a crucial endgame maneuver, seeking active participation and potential shelter from advancing pawns. A timely check now forces black's king to a more exposed square, preparing to penetrate the 7th rank and exploit the pawn structure's weaknesses. Bringing the rook back to the 6th rank exerts pressure and prepares to contest the open file, a crucial maneuver as the endgame material simplifies. Trading down into this rook endgame, a seemingly simple decision, fundamentally alters the material balance, forcing both sides to confront the simplified board and its inherent strategic demands. The pawn structure now resembles a distorted G-pawn island for black, creating a permanent weakness around the king that white can target, while black's own pawns on the kingside are disconnected and less mobile. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure now addresses the potential for black's remaining pieces to penetrate. The monarch finally finds a somewhat safer harbor, though the neighboring pawn structure remains a bit porous. Cementing your pawn structure on the kingside is crucial, aiming to create a protected passed pawn on the h-file and prevent black from infiltrating. Confronting the enemy's encroaching pawn on h4 directly, the king seeks to secure a safe haven amidst the remaining battlefield, aiming to avoid further isolation. Pushing the king forward initiates a race against black's isolated pawn, aiming to solidify white's central presence before any potential counterplay can materialize. Securing the pawn structure on the queenside with b6 offers black some breathing room, preventing white's rook from infiltrating further down the file and solidifying the king's protection on that flank, though it does create a slight weakness on c6. Initiating a pawn push on the kingside aims to gain space and potentially create weaknesses for the opponent's monarch, even though it risks leaving the pawn chain behind vulnerable. Exposing the king to open files, especially with such an advanced pawn structure, introduces significant long-term risks. Consolidating the pawn mass and preparing for potential threats on the kingside should have been paramount. Pawn structure cracks open as the kingside pawn chain collapses. Opening up the queenside with the pawn push aims to create a passed pawn on the queenside, a crucial objective as the game simplifies into an endgame. This frees up the rook on the file, potentially for a central invasion or to support the new queenside majority. Pushing the king forward here opens up opportunities for the monarch to participate actively in the endgame, aiming to control the central squares and potentially harass black's isolated pawns. Breaking open the kingside pawns with capture opens up the file for the rook, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses that might arise from the pawn structure now that the queens are off. A critical pawn grab solidifies white's material advantage, initiating the final stage of simplification. The king's grand tour begins, a desperate dash towards the center to salvage a pawn-down endgame. Your monarch, now a veritable kingpin in the center, boldly advances to a square that guarantees a strong presence and potential for further king-led infiltration. The black king, exposed by the preceding exchanges, now faces the stark reality of a vulnerable position, a consequence of relinquishing central control and allowing white's monarch such assertive forward movement across the board. Securing the pawn is a logical step to advance the kingside pawns, transforming the endgame's pawn structure and aiming to create a passed pawn on the kingside. The black king ventures out, embracing a dynamic confrontation in this endgame's heart, aiming to disrupt white's advancing pawn structure before it solidifies further. Stabilizing the pawn structure on the queenside becomes paramount now, as that isolated b-pawn could become a liability if not properly supported. Securing the king's escape route to g8 offers a touch of proactive defense, a subtle nod to potential checks on the back rank even in this simplified endgame landscape. Asserting control over the central squares with the monarch initiates a crucial endgame march towards potential passed pawn promotion. Navigating toward the center is crucial now, as the black king seeks refuge and opportunities in the remaining open space. Instilling fear into the opponent's monarch, the white king marches forward, preparing to escort the passed pawn to glory. The king is forced to wander into the open, making it a vulnerable target for remaining pieces. The king's march towards the center signals an aggressive endgame intent, aiming to leverage its increased mobility in this simplified position. King activity is paramount in this endgame. Bringing the monarch into the fray is the only path to victory, though it carries inherent risks. The monarch ventures forward, seeking to exploit the exposed black king and usher in a swift victory. The king, now unleashed from its protective pawn shield, embarks on an adventurous path towards the queenside, seeking to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create a passed pawn of its own. The king boldly advances, seeking to escort the pawns to glory, a daring endeavor in this simplified battlefield. The king ventures further into enemy territory, a bold maneuver aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and perhaps even threaten white's king if it overextends. Capturing the pawn with the king dramatically simplifies the position, aiming to centralize the monarch and create unstoppable passed pawns from the remaining kingside majority. The king's journey through the center, a perilous trek, now seeks refuge on the edge of the board, a testament to its newfound vulnerability in this simplified landscape. The rook's relocation to c5 immediately tightens the grip on the queenside, preparing to advance the passed pawn and further restrict black's king. The king's journey to c6 initiates a desperate quest to activate the monarch, aiming to challenge white's dominant pawn structure before it becomes an unstoppable force. Snapping up that pawn drastically simplifies the endgame, aiming for a quick conversion of material advantage by clearing a path for your king to become an active participant. The rook now marches to c6, a bold step aiming to disrupt white's tightly controlled king's side and potentially create threats on the queen side, a clear indication black is not content with a passive endgame. The white king boldly ventures towards the queen side, aiming to secure the advanced passed pawn and perhaps create a new one.